Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm talking with Coltan Scrivner. Coltan is a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago. He is a fellow at the Institute for Mind and Biology, and he studies something called morbid curiosity. He answers questions about why or how people sometimes find enjoyment in fictionally dangerous scenarios. He's interested in horror, in things that are morbid, and trying to understand the functions of emotions and the evolution of human behavior. So I've been following his work for a little bit, and I was curious to hear him talk about morbid curiosity, talk about some of the research he's published, some of the measures he's created, and that's what we talk about in our conversation. We first start out by talking about what is curiosity, and then what is morbid curiosity. We talk about the origins of it, and some of the critiques of terror management and negative trait bias. We discuss how there's no absolutes for morbid curiosity. We talk about state versus trait morbid curiosity. We talk about how morbid curiosity correlates with personality, such as the Big Five. We talk about his own measure of morbid curiosity, what factors he found, and why he used factor analysis. We talk about why we choose to be scared and watch horror films. We talk about how themes from horror could have clinical implications for disorders such as generalized anxiety, and some of the potential challenges of using horror for clinical treatment. This was such a fun conversation. It really was. We have in the middle part of the conversation kind of a nice discussion about horror films and just the horror, theme in general. I believe when we recorded this was a couple of days before Halloween, if I'm not mistaken, and so that was kind of on our minds, and so we talk about some of the themes and why horror and some of the morbid pleasures are such a big industry, and we talk about really thought it was interesting about the clinical implications as well, and I think we had a nice exchange on that and some of the pragmatic implications that this research could have. And so now I bring you Coltan Scrivner. I'm here with Coltan Scrivner. Coltan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've followed you online for a while, and super excited to talk to you about your research interest and what you've been doing and all that. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat with you about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell folks just kind of your potted biography, what you do and where you're from and what you currently research, and any future projects you're working on.
Sure. So I currently in Chicago. So I grew up in Oklahoma, went to school there, did my master's there, and then I moved up to the University of Chicago for my PhD. So I'm in the Department of Comparative Human Development, and I'm in the Behavior Biology Lab at the Institute for Mind and Biology. And so a lot of my work looks at the biological basis of behavior, but kind of it includes lots of other things. But that's kind of the thread that runs through most of my work.
Nice.
Currently, I guess most of my research is on the psychology of horror fandom, why people like to engage in scary play, and the psychology of morbid curiosity. And it's kind of taking some moves towards mental health now. So looking at anxiety and how that interacts with the scary play. Yeah,
no, that's great. So you're still at the University of Chicago, or you finished?
Yeah, I'm finishing up my last year.
Oh, yes, the final year. Yes, that's always a fun time.
Final year.
That's great. Do you have any ideas or plans when you're finished, or to be determined?
So I'll graduate in June of 2022.
And then just
plans like when I'm finished.
Yeah. So just on the market or
I'm on the academic job market right now. I'm also writing a book for Penguin Random House. I've got I did a Facebook internship over the summer and got an offer back from them. So kind of like shopping around a little bit, but on the academic job market, a little bit on the tech job market.
No, that's great. It is very, very difficult for folks if they're not doing like tenure track or academics to try and go out into the world if they're not clinical. And so That's good.
Yeah.
You got some irons in the fire. That's great.
Sometimes too many irons.
Yeah, sure, for sure. Okay, so your big interest is morbid curiosity, which has a lot of different tentacles to it, which is cool. Right. We get into all of it. So I guess the first thing that it'd probably be really helpful to do is to kind of define both of those terms separately and then kind of together. So how do you typically define curiosity? What's usually under the umbrella of morbid? And then how do you have the operationalized definition of morbid curiosity?
Right. Curiosity has been, from my understanding, pretty difficult to kind of pin down. There's not really an agreed upon definition for it. Mm-hmm. It kind of started back, I think William James probably gave the first psychological sort of explanation of it, but even he gave, not really a concrete definition, but rather just split it into types. And this is what people in psychology, it seems like they've been doing for a while. So James, I think, split it into sort of this novelty seeking or exploration kind of curiosity that we see in animals and also in humans. And then he said the second type is more something like scientific curiosity or metaphysical wonder. And that's more about sort of understanding something versus exploring it. And then there was a psychologist in I think it was must have been in the 60s, Daniel Berline. He was probably one of the most famous curiosity researchers. And he did a lot about perceptual curiosity versus epistemic. So very similar to James's stuff with sort of curiosity about new stuff versus more epistemic or knowledge about something. And then he also split curiosity into this, I think it was diversive and what's the second one? Well, there was, diversive and specific. So diversive is more like you're bored and you're seeking out stimulation. And specific curiosity is more like finding one thing and trying to learn a lot more about it. I believe he was one of the first to argue that it was motivated by a gap in knowledge, which now is, I think, sort of the predominant theory of curiosity, at least in psychology and some human-computer interaction stuff that I think it was George Lowenstein in the 90s wrote this very influential paper about the information gap theory of curiosity, where he basically argued that curiosity should be thought of as only internally motivated. And I think he also made it just state curiosity. So like curiosity in the moment as opposed to a predisposition. So internally motivated exploration of gaps in knowledge basically was his thing. I tend to not use, of course, I use a definition because everybody uses a definition, and it's very important in science to have a definition. But I tend to approach things more from an ethological perspective, I guess. So I tend to use Tenbergen's 4 questions as a way of thinking about a scientific problem rather than a strict definition. So I tend to use a pretty broad all that's a long-winded way to say. I tend to use a pretty broad definition of curiosity is just a drive state for information, I guess would be a very simple way of saying it. Could be internally motivated, could be externally motivated. I think it really is more useful to think about how curiosity changes over the lifetime, or what causes it in the moment, or how did it evolve? Do you see it in other species? I think that's right now a more fruitful area in the curiosity research than trying to give I think we don't know enough about it yet to give it a strict definition. And so I think we need to do a little more deep thinking about curiosity, be a little more curious about curiosity rather than trying to give it a strict definition just yet.
Sure.
And then morbid curiosity, it's not really like a completely separate thing. It's more of an interest in like why are people curious about things that could be threatening or deemed negative. So this is not like an entirely separate concept from curiosity, but I do think it requires a special explanation in some ways. And so morbid curiosity I've been defining as an interest or curiosity about threatening or dangerous situations or phenomena. And I think the reason it requires this sort of special explanation is that, why would we be curious or want information about negative things, right? Why would we sometimes want to feel bad? Why would we sometimes want to feel afraid? I think when people think about curiosity, they tend to think of the more sort of flowery, positive side of it. You have scientific curiosity, or you're curious about a person, or you're curious about a new place. But we're also curious about really dark things sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just an area of, in curiosity research, I noticed that a lot of people hadn't really explored. So they'd mostly explored the more positive aspects of curiosity and not really investigated the what seemed to be the darker sides of curiosity.
Why do you think that is? Is it just a type of avoidance, or is it a type of social taboo, or why are we not wanting to explore the darker sides of things that we're all doing, we're all curious about? Why do you think there's a sort of a hesitation there to explore that?
I think some of it is probably taboo. So there was a paper in I believe it was the 80s, called I forget the name of it, but they created a scale called Curiosity About Morbid Events. And basically they were trying to explain morbid curiosity. And to my knowledge, this is the first sort of empirical study of morbid curiosity. I think it was Zuckerman and Lytle, I don't know how you say their last name. But Zuckerman obviously is famous for his sensation-seeking work. And so his view of it was that morbid curiosity was really just sensation-seeking. And that's, I think, reflected in the way that he constructed this scale. So the scale is very sort of driven by violence, like violent interactions. Most of the items are about different kinds of violence. And what I've been finding is that is like one aspect of curiosity, of morbid curiosity, but it's not the whole thing. And I think he did that because, again, he had this kind of sensation-seeking perspective on why people do things. And so it made sense to him that violence would kind of be the center of that. But I'm not sure why other scientists haven't really picked up, like even that paper. I mean, it's cited decently well, but nobody has really taken the morbid curiosity stuff from that. Nobody's really done anything. Like that scale was never validated. It was never, it was only used, I think, in like one or two other papers, maybe. So I don't know why. I think a little bit of it is taboo. I think some of it might be, people don't like to hear about the bad things they do in research. They like to hear about why they're good, right? And not that morbid curiosity is bad, but certainly there's some taboo kind of topics. I think people sometimes don't want to hear about that.
I think in a general way, broadly speaking, much of the history of psychology as a formalized discipline, if you go all the way back to Freud, let's say, and all the way till current day, really until 21st century, much of it was focused on pathology, psychopathology, all the horrible things that happen to humans, and the treatment of humans, and so there has, which is important, but some of it's politically motivated, some of it isn't, but push within psychology as a discipline to say, well, wait a minute, there's positive things too, and you have the whole positive psych subset and many derivatives of that, and which I think is on the face of it is fine. We need to look at the whole human experience, of course. I mean, it's not just what goes wrong, but again, it's interesting that there are still many kind of untapped areas that just don't get touched or discussed or talked about. And I think some of your work and kind of my thoughts are that you can understand more about humans, you can understand more about many things by understanding some of the dark corners, but I mean, that's it's not for everybody.
And again, that's not even to say, I mean, I don't think that morbid curiosity is even bad. It's certainly, I don't think it's any worse than any other trait that we have. Taken to an extreme, it's bad. Just like taken to an extreme, extroversion or openness or any of the big five might be bad, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know. Yeah, I guess it's just because when scientists have researched sort of the dark side of humanity, they tend to make it like the dark side, right? It's like why we do bad things, not that there's this sort of thing that seems bad, but just because we're interested in it doesn't make us bad, right? And I think we saw a little bit of that with the violent video game discourse in the late 90s and 2000s, like that whole crazy stuff, right? So basically it was like, well, of course, playing violent video games must make you bad because violence is bad. My understanding of that literature, it's kind of a mess, and there's tens of thousands of articles on it now, but it doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that playing violent video games makes the average person bad, right? It doesn't make them any more violent.
No, you could do this. You could broaden this out to mass media in general. I mean, one of my friends, Chris Ferguson, who does this research. I mean, he's you know,
he wrote a book on it, right?
Yeah. He's written a few books, and that's his whole point. I mean, he's in that research. I mean, he does that. And he basically is saying, like, you know, this is bunk science. I mean, we've shown that this is not true. You know, I think maybe in the 90s, you know, it was a kind of intuitive, like, of course, you know, and then as you do this, you know, I think this is, again, not the same, but I think it's way more complicated. But you see a few folks that do this now with social media. I have many negative things to say about social media, but I don't think it is the cause for all of these harms for teenagers or for young people.
Or at least the evidence doesn't seem to be too
conclusive. It's an impact, but I don't think it's, you know, it's a one-to-one thing. And I think some people really take that and run with it. So it's kind of the redux of what was going on with video games or violent movies or whatever. You know, I mean,
I think that's probably is the reason why people haven't really looked into morbid curiosity, because I think it would turn out like the video game stuff, you know, in a lot of ways, the violent video game stuff, or horror movies for that matter. There's been a little bit of research on horror movies. A lot of it was Zuckerman's sensation-seeking stuff, but there haven't really been a lot of good studies on why people scare themselves for fun and what that can do for them, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's just it, right? It's just, we have to, I mean, it's like a lot of things, but in this particular case, we have to see, okay, well, what is this, right? Yeah. You don't have to place a moral attribution or some value judgment on it. You can do that later if you want, but we should study and know what things are. And so, this gets into some of your research you've done on this. So first off, humans tend to have a negative trait bias, right? We're looking at, or we're more prone to, if you will, type of heuristic to see the negative in things. It's just kind of what we pull towards in many things. And we do have some preoccupation with death. I do think we have a big aversion to it. People don't want to talk about it. They don't want to think about it. And I think that's probably a good thing. If you take an evolutionary stance, many folks will say, well, we've created religion, or we've created some sense of self-deception or denial, because if we just think about the fact that we know we're going to die, it might not be other animals know they will die in the same way that we do. And so we have to kind of put these kind of fences up. Otherwise we'll just, you know, be in, you know, panic and misery and dread, just feel any moment we could die from a million things. So I think that's probably a helpful thing. But, you know, when it comes to morbid curiosity, there's things like people watching very violent films, or there are people reminding themselves that death they're going to die, right. Or, you know, that someone will see a car accident, and, you know, everyone will watch even though they don't want to. Or it's like my not my favorite, but it's the one that I have this reaction to, is when I see an athlete is playing a sport and you see a leg break, like you see it happen. It's the grossest thing. I don't want to see it, but I'm like watching that video like 80 times in a row,
rewinding it and trying to slow-mo it.
Yeah. And I'm like, I have such a, like, you know, dissonance the whole time where I'm like, this is terrible. This is so, like, I'm grossed out by it. You know, the bones sticking the other way from the other person's body. But, like, you know, I'm watching it 80 times. Right. And we have these ideas, these things that remind us of death, right? We're trying to not think about it, but in a sense, you know, the horror film industry is, you know, multi-million-dollar industry every year. And, you know, there's many, not just for Halloween, but just for many things throughout the year where people are, you know, giving themselves these opportunities or these environments to get scared or spooked or whatever. So what's going on here? Why are we don't want to die and we don't want to think about it, but then we're doing all this kind of imaginative kind of stuff of, like, seeing all these other things where people are seriously injured or harmed or that we see in our fictions, or so how do we make sense of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot there to unpack. I think, like, I have some issues with terror management theory, at least from, like, a theoretical standpoint. Can you give us the Cliff Notes version of it, and then tell us why you don't like it? Well, I think the Cliff Notes version is, I'm not sure that it's the case that people are really anxious about death. I think some people are. right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just not sure that that's I'm not sure that that is a human preoccupation for everyone. I think it's maybe more so in some cultures and less so in others. I think some cultures embrace death in ways that don't.
That's fair. That's fair. Yeah.
So I think that you can create an anxiety about death, and people can certainly have it. But I'm not sure that I'm not sure I buy the theoretical rationale for why it must exist.
That is endogenous to humans.
Yeah. I don't think it's something that every human has to overcome, and some are just better at it. I think it's just. So I think it's somewhere in the middle, and some people tend to make it worse, and some people tend to make it better. But I don't think it's a thing that we're preoccupied with yet. That's endogenous that we have to overcome necessarily. And I think I have some issues with the negativity bias stuff too, only because I'm not even sure what that means. Like, I don't know what it means for us to say that I'm more attentive to negative things. Like, what is a negative thing? I guess I know I just said, well, we don't need to define curiosity to study it, but I think when it comes to negativity, I think what's negative for me may not be negative for you. People who are watching horror movies that enjoy them, they wouldn't say that's negative. They would say it's negative if it's not scary, right? Someone who doesn't enjoy a horror movie would say it's negative if it is disgusting or scary. And I suppose there's probably people who've written more on this about, like, well, it's really about valence, right? It's about negatively valence.
Yeah. These aren't absolutes.
Sure, but I don't even know what it means for something. I don't know. Negatively valenced things. I don't know if I don't know. I think it's just really about. It's too broad of a category to say. That's fair. We are attracted to negative things. I think, in fact, Pascal Boyer wrote a really great, co-authored a really great article a few years ago. He's done a lot of work on rumors and spread of information. He showed in a study that it's really threat bias, not negativity bias by itself, right? It's really threat bias that we're motivated to spread information and consume information about. And I think that makes a lot more sense, right? I think it makes more sense when something is threatening in some way. And that's also how I've sort of built this theoretical model of morbid curiosity. It's not about negativity per se. It's not even about death per se, but it's about threats, right? It's about things that can injure you or ways that you can be injured, knowledge about that. And I think that is at least a little more concise. It may not be right on the target. This is stuff that I've just started doing. I'm sure there are things that I'm very wrong about with it. But I think it's at least a little more theoretically precise than just saying we're attracted to negative things, and that's why we're morbidly curious. That's just not a very satisfying answer for me.
Right. Sure. Is on the threat piece of it, is that kind of like how we understand, I think, for the most part, that, it's not punishment, but it's the threat of punishment. That's the thing that is most preventative or activating for people, right? It's that whole, it could happen, it might happen, not the thing happening itself, because there's more variability there, or do you think this is mapping on the same way?
I think that's a really good analogy. I don't know if it works exactly the same, but I think it's a great analogy that I hadn't really considered before. But yeah, the threat of punishment, or even, if you're expecting something good, it's always the expectation of the good thing that feels best, not when you finally get it, right? Yeah,
that's right.
Anxiously awaiting it. So yeah, I think that's some of it. And I think it's just easier for our minds to have a predisposition to something more specific, like a threat, than just sort of this nebulous sort of negativity. That's hard. I feel like that's difficult to select for from an evolutionary perspective. I think threats also difficult to probably select for, but I think that there are probably aspects of threats, which is what I've tried to do in this research, is show that there are certain aspects of threats that that do draw our attention.
So what you're saying is that there aren't necessarily absolutes with this stuff,
right?
And I agree with you. I've said a bunch of times, I hate discussions about just defining terms forever and ever, because no one's going to agree on anything. It's just kind of a wasteful point of discussion, I think, for many things. But is it? I'm for some reason putting this in like this either or thing. I'm not trying to do that, but is it just relative? Is it based on each individual person, where it's, hey, look, what's terrifying for you is not terrifying for me, or what's, morbidly interesting for you is not. I can see someone get shot and doesn't bother me, and for you, you could be throwing up, next to your your neighbor there. I mean, is it just a kind of personality or temperament difference, or relative to each person, or how do you I guess kind of make sense of it?
I think, morbid curiosity is probably a higher order trait, and sort of at its core is threat detection, which I think is universal among humans. Right? That is something that's universal among humans, and I think that kind of sits at the core of morbid curiosity, and it motivates a lot of our morbidly curious behaviors. There are a lot of other things, a lot of other traits that influence that. So disgust sensitivity. If you're really sensitive to disgust, it's going to influence the kinds of things you're morbidly curious about. You're not going to be as curious. It's not that you're less curious about disgusting things. There's just a competing cost, right? And you're going to take that into account. I think, and we can talk about this in a minute, but morbid curiosity, I guess, at its base is really just a cost-benefit analysis, right? It's really, I think it is. I think it's just a cost-benefit analysis of there's always a benefit, or almost always a benefit, to learning about threats. And it might be more beneficial if the threat is more salient. It might be less beneficial if it's something you think is less salient. And there are always some costs associated with it. And some of those costs are baked into the nature of the object. So, interacting with someone who is violent is always going to carry a cost, regardless of, who you are. But depending on your other characteristics, it might be a lower cost. If you're a big, strong guy, interacting with someone who's violent might have less of a cost than if you're not a big, strong guy, right? If it's on a TV screen, it's going to have less of a cost than if you're in person. Some things are more about the way that you react. So with disgust sensitivity, you don't like the feeling of feeling disgusted, and that's going to be a cost. So, and that tallies up on that cost benefit sort of analysis. So I think that there is a core to morbid curiosity that is present in everyone. And that's why, when you drive down the road, that's like the involuntary aspect of morbid curiosity. That's the driving down the road, rubbernecking to a car crash. Or if there's a fist fight on the street, everyone stops and looks, right? Or if an athlete breaks a bone, maybe not everyone goes back and watches it 8 times, but everybody wants to see what happened, right? They might go back and watch it once. And then depending on how
they'll start watching it and then stop mid clip, dude. I can't watch it.
But that's a perfect representation of that cost benefit analysis, right? I want to know about it. I want to see slow-mo, how it happened, but it's too gross. And so I have to control that in some ways. I have to cover my eyes or look away or fast forward, whatever.
Right.
I think it's a perfect example of that cost benefit analysis, in action, kind of moment to moment. So yeah, I think that there's a base core that's present in everyone, and it's more present sort of in involuntary aspects, morbid curiosity. And there are other traits that influence that to a degree, but more so they probably influence these more voluntary types of morbid curiosity, things like interest in horror movies, or interest in ghosts, or interest in boxing or MMA.
I guess my question here is that I do want to ask about some of the things on your scale, so I might bring this up now, but I guess how much of this is on the differences with the individual? Because it sounds like there's a sort of continuum here that's going on, right? That's happening. So we have the core that you're discussing, and then there's a whole broad range of people that have very high disgust sensitivity and very low disgust sensitivity, and the likes. And so, how much of temperament or personality comes into play here? Is that how we can understand? Okay, we understand at the core, everyone's going to have some morbid curiosity. Fine.
I think that's the negativity bias literature people have been picking up on. I think they're picking up in some ways on that core morbid curiosity, like the threat bias, the negativity bias literature. I think they've been picking up on that core. And then I think what I've been adding to that is this temperament stuff that you're talking about. Sort of personality temperament aspect, that there is a core, but there's also sort of a continuum on how extreme that can be, and then also types of things that you're morbidly curious about.
Right. Because you could be curious about, the athlete's injury, but you don't want to watch, very explicit, pornography, right? Sure. I mean, there's difference here. Sure. So I guess I don't know if how much you've looked at this, but I mean, is there any literature or research on how this maps onto? I mean, we can just use Big Five, I guess. You can find other personality measures as well, but in terms of various traits of certain individuals that will, have more, higher, if you will, on morbid curiosity, or lower, and or the differences between if there is a state and trait of morbid curiosity. Those are two questions, so I'll let you answer both.
So starting at the end of that, I definitely think there's probably a state and trait, just like there's a state and trait for most things. I haven't looked into state morbid curiosity too much yet, but it's something that I plan to do eventually. I'm more so trying to establish just kind of what it is right now at a temperament or predisposition level. As far as the Big Five goes, there aren't really a lot of strong correlations with the Big Five. I just pulled up one of my papers just now because I couldn't remember the exact correlations, but I remember, so this is the Psychology of Morbid Curiosity paper. So it's slightly, in that paper, it was like very slightly correlated with extroversion, so maybe like 0.15 R value, slightly related to openness, 0.12, but really not strongly related to a lot of Big Five stuff. You would think that neuroticism, I think, is measured a bit differently, maybe in the measure I use the Hexaco, and I think it's measured a bit differently in that than it is in, like, let's say the TIPI, which is the 10 item, but in this particular case, I think neuroticism was only correlated with certain subscales, and then overall not significantly correlated. So, I mean, that's one reason I found it pretty interesting, is that it wasn't explained. Like, these behaviors weren't explained very well by, or these interests weren't explained very well by previously existing scales. I mean, there were some that mapped pretty strongly onto it. So, for example, I think animal reminder disgust mapped pretty strongly onto morbid curiosity. So low animal reminder disgust was pretty strongly correlated with high morbid curiosity. I think that there was also a PPI scale. Let me see if I've got it right here. A PPI scale that mapped pretty heavily. Oh yeah, rebellious nonconformity. That one I think is probably a bit more culturally specific. I think in a lot of Western cultures, the topics of morbid curiosity, so violence or dangerous people or body disgust or to some extent paranormal stuff, is a bit taboo. And so people sort of flout social norms or don't put as much weight into social norms just by default might be a bit more interested in morbid curiosity. I'm not sure which one of those is the higher order trait, whether it's rebelliousness or morbid curiosity, but certainly it makes sense that in the West, where those topics are a little bit taboo, it's going to correlate pretty strongly with social rebelliousness. So there are some traits that I think, show good validity for the scale, but there's nothing that, even when I included all the scales that I've looked at, disgust sensitivity and all the psychopathy subscales, the Big Five. I think I also used Todd Kashtan's 5 Dimensions of Curiosity scale, which is a really great scale, but none of it really mapped very strongly onto morbid curiosity. And even when I included like did a big regression with all of them and looked at just the significant ones to see how much variance I could explain. And I think like social curiosity came out as somewhat positively correlated. I think the social rebelliousness, animal disgust reminder, I think age, and maybe sex when it was all together, so males and younger age. All of those combined, I think, only accounted for about 45 or 50% of the variance, which is a lot, but that leaves a lot of stuff unexplained when you're using that many scales, right?
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I would have thought it would have been a little bit higher. I mean, those are small to moderate correlations. I mean, those aren't large.
Well, the 0.5 would have been R squared, so variance would have been about 50.
Yes.
Yeah, so about 50% of the variance when you include all of them. The correlations I gave you earlier were R values, but as far as variance goes, I think when I included all the scales, did a reduced model and looked at just the ones that were significant, all included, I think it was like social curiosity, rebelliousness, animal disgust reminder, age, sex, and maybe one other. It was sort of sensation seeking related. I can't remember, but I do remember that. The total variance explained was almost 50%, which again is good, but that leaves a lot of stuff on.
Right. Yeah, just a lot on.
Because I was kind of expecting that to explain basically all. Like I was thinking, okay, some aspects of psychopathy, some aspects of disgust, some aspects of curiosity, like those are kind of the core of this trait, which I think those are in some ways the core of the trait, but there's still a lot, I think, left to be explained.
Yeah. Well, I mean, since we're here and we're talking about measures, let's talk about your measure. which you created.
Mhm.
Maybe just tell us about it, how you came up with it, and how it all happened, and then I can ask you some of the specifics.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I started out thinking, so I used that curiosity about morbid events scale as sort of a starting place. So that one that was invented in the 80s, I didn't think it was a very good scale, but I did think it tapped into the violence aspect pretty well. So I kind of started with that, and I had done some research on horror, and so I used sort of invented some items about interest in scary things, so like the supernatural or ghosts or the occult. And so I kind of had at first this idea, well, maybe there are two dimensions, right? Maybe there's kind of this violence dimension, but certainly there must be some other kind of dimension. So I came up with a list of items. I did this exploratory factor analysis on a pilot, and it came back kind of a mess. So things were not loading too well. There was kind of this violence component, and there was kind of this sort of paranormal component, but there was some other stuff that started popping up. There was this thing about body disgust that started to show up in a few items. And so I went back, added in some more items, right? Took out the ones that didn't work, added in some more items related to body disgust to see if those would load together. Ran a new factor analysis. Found that those three did kind of load together, but there were still some things that were jumbled, that looked like there might have been some common factor, but it wasn't clear. So I went back, added some more items to it, ran on a new sample again. And the stuff I added this time was more about understanding dangerous people. So not necessarily witnessing the violence, like watching like what does a fight look like, but more so what do dangerous people act like? How can I identify them? And so that kind of popped out a new factor. And this time they were all nice and tidy. So items loaded onto one scale only or one subdimension only, and loaded pretty strongly. So that's kind of how that paper came about. But I started out thinking it was more maybe I didn't have a hard reason for it other than, I'd done research on violence, I'd done some research on horror. These two things I saw, relationships between them and with respect to why people were interested in them. And so I started out kind of with that idea, but it morphed into this. It turns out, there's really maybe 4 different dimensions.
Were you happy with the sample size? It was 300 individuals. Is that right?
It was, let me see it was around 300 or 400. Like I think I was happy with it because, so like I said, I actually conducted 4 pilots before I ever ran the first big factor analysis, right? And so I think the total sample size for that first exploratory factor analysis was over 1,000 people. And you might know this better than me, I'm not sure, because clinical psychologists are really great sometimes at factor analysis.
I like factor analysis. I don't do it, but I enjoy I like the methodology. I think it's a really helpful methodology for many things.
It was the first time I had really done it, and so I kind of had to teach myself a lot of it. But it didn't seem like there were a lot of hard and fast rules for sample size when it came to factor analysis. There were some rules of thumb, like I think it was 10 people per item or something was a rule of thumb, or anything over 200 was a rule of thumb. And so I kind of just made sure I surpassed all the rules of thumb. And at this point, the scale has been it's been taken by thousands of people because I have it on my website and people can just go take it. And like now and then I kind of look at it to see if it's falling into place, and every time it does. I've been working with a clinical psychologist in Canada, Jeremy Stewart, who I'm working with him on some suicide research with respect to morbid curiosity. And he, before I was involved with that, he had the scale and he ran it on I think almost 2,000 people. And it came out, it came out, the 4 factors fell out just like they're supposed to. It's been translated into, I don't know how many languages now, maybe 6 or 7 languages. So I worked with Matthias Claesen, who I don't know if you know him or not. You should have him on your show. He's really great. He does horror research. He's a Danish horror scholar.
Cool.
He and I worked together on a project where we translated it into Danish. Fell out in Danish just like it's supposed to.
Wow.
4 factors.
Cool.
So I'm pretty satisfied with the way that it's been working. I think that I'm not close to thinking that, or I'm not opposed to thinking that I could be missing a factor, or that maybe
sure.
There could be things that I haven't considered. But I think the scale I have does tap pretty well onto morbidly curious behaviors. So I've conducted some behavior experiments also where I've used the scale to see if it predicts morbidly curious behaviors, like choosing like one of the items in this behavior task. It was like a computerized task, and so it would show, for one of the tasks, it would show people two descriptions, right? And they would click the description that they want to see the photo of. And one of the descriptions was, would you like to see a photo of a man who saved his friend from drowning? So sort of interested in like people who are pro-social, right? The other one was, would you like to see a picture of a man who killed his girlfriend and ate her? Now, there's no real reason, I guess, to see like, why would you want to see the guy's face, right? Unless you're trying to learn something about people who do those kinds of things, right?
Sure, yeah.
That was the idea, at least going into that specific item. Yeah, and what you find is that people who score high on the morbid curiosity scale are much more likely to select a man who killed his girlfriend and ate her.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because when I was reading the paper where you detail the scale, I remember it had very good validity and reliability, which is always a good thing. And so it's cool though to hear that many people have taken it now at this point, and that there's others that have been able to use it as well. So just continue with the scale. So if you want, you don't have to, but as much as you want, but if you want to just briefly explain the exploratory factor analysis, we don't have to do a mini stats session here, but just kind of explain it to listeners. Some people may not know about it. Just kind of the process, and then why that's important for creating a new measure, especially one like yours. And we pleased with the loading of the variables and things like that. So maybe just give us the kind of brief overview of it.
Yeah, I mean, the brief overview is, you come to well, the way that I came to it, I was hoping someone else had created a scale, so I didn't have to do it. But the only one that was out there was this scale that even I, as someone who had never made a scale, I was like, that's not a great scale. And so, I came to it with this sort of light theoretical idea about what morbid curiosity might be or what it might encompass. I tried to create a long list of items that sort of tap into different aspects of that, right? So about curiosity, about threats. And then, you get a sample of people, in this case, maybe 300 or 400 people. You have them answer, like a Likert scale. How much do you agree or disagree with these questions or these statements?
Was it 7 point, 6 point Likert scale? What was it?
So I like middle points, I really do, but I decided to leave one out on my scale because some of the topics are a little taboo, and I thought people would just select the middle point to get out of it would be a lot of fence sitting, I think, and not because people are on the fence, but
that's fair.
When you're presented with a morbid stimulus, you can either look at it or not look at it. You can't. There's no middle ground, right?
That's fair.
So so even though I do think middle points are good typically, I chose a 6 point scale just so people wouldn't select it, so that they wouldn't feel bad saying like, I would go to an execution,
Right.
So you do that. People answer the questions, and factor analysis essentially sees if questions are answered in similar ways together. So people who want to go to an execution, but they also say that they're curious about medieval battles, or whatever. They were also interested in MMA or boxing. Are people who think that being a criminal profiler would be a fun job, also interested in true crime documentaries, right? And the idea is that you'll be able to extract these dimensions or these factors that sort of are latent in the world. And the idea is that each item will load on one factor only. And in the best case scenario, it loads on one factor only. And in my case, I had this sort of super factor of morbid curiosity, right? And it was split into 4 types, I guess. Sure. And so each type is sort of correlated with the other. So, if you score high in the violence dimension, it is positively correlated with the minds of dangerous people dimension, but not too strongly, right? Otherwise, it would be one factor. And so you kind of look for pretty strong item loading. So meaning that items explain, or the factors explain a lot of variance, and how people answer the items. And then you also look for small correlations between the factors, but not too small, not too big, kind of a Goldilocks thing. And then I guess that's basically it. Yeah.
And so you came to the 4 factors. So what were the 4 factors, and how? So this is being generated because when you do factor analysis, you have all these matrices and all these things like that, and so you get the wonderful eigenvalues and all that good stuff.
Right.
But what were the four factors that kind of spilled out from this?
So the four factors were paranormal, which is broadly speaking, right? So paranormal could include things like ghosts or maybe like the occult or witches. I didn't include an item about aliens, but we could talk later about why it would include aliens. So things that are sort of outside of our grasp of everyday life, but that could be dangerous. The second subscale was minds of dangerous people. Or motives of dangerous people, minds of dangerous people. So basically trying to understand why bad people do bad things. And understanding who does, like, how do I identify this kind of person, right? And this is sort of the basis of, I think, true crime, right? I mean, that's what true crime thrives on. Whereas the third factor, violence, is more like what boxing thrives on. It's more about understanding the mechanics or the actual actions of what happens during a violent interaction. So those kinds of people might be interested in, a battle in the Middle Ages or a boxing match or a street fight or something like that. And the last dimension was body disgust or body violation. And this is just an understanding of what happens to the body when it's injured. What does it look like? This is, soccer player breaks their leg and you go back and you watch it 8 times in slow-mo to try to catch where the break is, right? Exactly what he did to break it. Maybe you're interested in autopsies or other kinds of things about like what happens to bodies, right?
And did you?
And in a lot of ways, these can be sort of strung together in a story. You have like the motives of the dangerous person who commits a violent act, then has body violation outcomes. So these are really all about like, and I guess I don't know the paranormal. Maybe that's a separate thing, but they really all are tied together by this idea of trying to understand threatening situations and kind of the outcomes associated with that, and how to identify them, how to avoid them, how to learn from them. Yeah.
Did you also look at some of the more, I guess you could say, demographic aspects of this? So did women versus men score higher on some factors, age, SES, kind of these demographic kind of pieces?
Yeah. So with age, it's mostly younger people who have higher morbid curiosity. I think that was true across all subscales. Which I think kind of makes sense, because if it's really about learning about situations that you don't find yourself in often, but if you do find yourself in it, you should know about it. You should be prepared for it. People who have lived longer have had more chances to do that, either through life experience or through simulations and fiction, right?
Fair enough.
So of course they're going to be less curious about it. With sex, I don't think there were too many differences between men and women. There were on some of the subscales. So men, for example, scored a bit higher on the violence subscale. I think in my original paper, and this may depend on the sample sometimes. I think in my original paper, men scored higher on each of the subscales. But in a lot of studies I've done since then, with larger sample sizes, there aren't too many differences. I think men pretty consistently score higher on the violence one. Women sometimes will score a little higher on minds of dangerous people. Sort of that stereotype about women in true crime, right? I think there's some truth to that. But overall, there aren't huge sex differences. It's one of the smaller, I think. It's consistent, but it's pretty small. And probably that has to do with other traits, to some extent, has to do with other traits that vary between the sexes that then influence morbid curiosity, right? Things like disgust sensitivity or formidability or other factors.
Anything with, again, socioeconomic status or geographical region or things like that?
With geographical region, I don't, with respect to at least like, the Danish sample we ran or the Brazilian sample we ran, I don't remember there being huge differences in the averages. So if you look at like, an average Dane scores pretty similarly to an average American when it comes to morbid curiosity. The scales are really pretty, almost every time I've ran it, it's like a really nice normal distribution. So lots of people are kind of in the middle of morbid curiosity. A few people are on each tail. So a few people have a little bit, a few people have a lot, most people have some of it. That's not true for the subscales always. So some of the subscales are skewed a little bit, but the overall morbid curiosity is pretty normally distributed. With respect to income, I think I've only looked at that once. I don't recall. I think it might have been a negative association, but not a strong one. But I didn't really, it was more of a control variable in that case. This was the pandemic practice paper we ran where we looked at, are horror fans more resilient in the pandemic? and we looked at morbid curiosity as well. And I think we controlled for income, so I didn't look at it too closely, but I do remember maybe there being a slight negative correlation, but I didn't look at the graphs, so that could be kind of a wonky. I don't know if it's linear, you know.
And so you have the scale, and you many people have taken it at this point, and what you can say is that humans have this proclivity of some morbid curiosity, some higher or lower than others, but we all kind of have this. Recently, I talked to Paul Bloom on the podcast, and his new book, The Sweet Spot, about suffering and pleasure and meaning, and it's very good. It's very provocative. It's good, and he was very
most
kind.
of Paul Bloom's books are very provocative.
Yeah, they're provocative in a cool way. He likes to think a lot.
They're great.
Yeah, it's great. It's not provocative for being provocative. It really is genuinely like kind of this questioning of sorts. And he's great, and we had a nice conversation, and we talked about this in his book. I think he makes these distinctions, which I think you've kind of alluded to as well, is this kind of chosen suffering and unchosen suffering. And so the way that he looks at it is like, look, we do chosen suffering all the time. We watch scary films, we do a crossword puzzle, we train for a marathon, these are things that are going to cause us some type of suffering, maybe a lot, maybe a little, some type of suffering, and we choose to do it for various reasons. And then there's unchosen suffering. His way of saying it is, someone dies, someone dies of a terminal illness, or, there's a natural disaster, or things like that. And his thing is like, maybe those experiences just suck. Like, we don't need to find some like big meaning out of it. It just sucks, and we don't want to have it again. Like, we'll find something out of it, but it just sucks. Like, there's nothing to say about it. And people kind of, go back and forth on that. But, we talk about this. So I guess in terms of for you specifically and studying, there's some overlap here, but this morbid curiosity thing of, why is it that people are going to get the shit scared out of them watching, 9 films now of The Conjuring and The Nun, and how many are in that series? I don't even know. Why are people watching, BDSM and just looking at people getting, we'll say voluntarily. I think there's an edge to that. There's a line on that sometimes, but of, people getting, whipped and spanked and hung up and chained and, gagged. And I mean, why are people doing this? But then why are people watching it? This is kind of voyeurism kind of thing that we like to watch, people. What's your, how do you make sense of this?
Yeah, I think so. Going back to the first part of that question, I think we did talk about it a little bit earlier, but this idea of voluntary versus involuntary, I think is how I said it. I think that's probably similar to what Paul Bloom's talking about when he says chosen versus unchosen. I think I haven't had a chance to read his new book yet, but I've talked to him a little bit about that stuff in general, right? And I think probably we'll have similar perspectives on that. I think that for the unchosen stuff, it's something that, like you said, it's not just because our attention goes towards something doesn't mean we enjoy it. Something that's really difficult in developmental studies to figure out, right? If a baby looks at something, are they enjoying it or are they not enjoying it? Because some papers say they look at it because it's surprising and they don't like it, and some papers say they look at it because it's interesting. So we can be interested in something from an intentional perspective and not enjoy it, right?
Sure.
So that would be the unchosen, and then the chosen would just be like you're talking about. Maybe I haven't looked at BDSM, but I imagine that people who are into BDSM are probably a little higher on morbid curiosity. And my first, again, I haven't given it much thought, so this is the first impression. My first impression would be that morbid curiosity is, again, a cost-benefit analysis, right? So you learn something about what might be a threatening situation in a safe way, then the costs are low, benefits are high. And I imagine in many ways, BDSM is kind of like that. You're learning about something that looks and maybe even in some ways feels a bit violent, but in the best case scenarios is very safe, right? Or is meant to be. It's meant to be safe, right? And I think once it feels unsafe, then it becomes you're not as curious about it anymore, right?
Right. Yeah.
The cost quickly escalates.
Right.
And so I think that's probably my next study. Clearly, is on people who engage in BDSM, because actually I do think that's a good example of people who are simulating a threatening scenario in a much safer way than if the scenario were real, so to speak. I think we do that with horror all the time. I think we do it with scary things all the time. We simulate them in a way that we have more control over.
Right.
Or at least we can say stop when it's time to stop. We can turn the TV off. We can turn the game off, say the safe word in the haunted house, whatever.
Right.
I think probably there's some pretty strong similarities to BDSM of that.
Yeah. I mean, Paul talked about this too. I mean, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think that that's a reasonable explanation. I can't remember if he said this or not. I don't recall, but it just doesn't feel complete though. Right? Like there are things where it's like, look, we get it, right? I'm going to watch this movie. I'm going to watch this, or I'm going to engage in these types of sexual affinities, etc. And, I can do it in a safe place, quote unquote. It's a simulation. It's a fiction. It's a, whatever. And I can play it out a bunch of times and know if anything bad were to happen, I've had some exposure to this. I've had some imaginative play with this. And so it's maybe if you want to say unconsciously, I don't
think a lot of this
helpful.
Is conscious motivation. Yeah, I don't think a lot of this is conscious motivation, right? Sometimes it might be. Yeah, but I don't think people go into horror movies being like, all right, now I know what to do if there's a serial killer, right? Maybe some people do that, but like, and maybe doing that in some ways, we can talk about this in a little bit, maybe doing that in some ways could be useful. But yeah, I think it's just it's an impulse that we have, right? Like this impulse of, your brain's always calculating cost benefits to everything. And sometimes those, kind of arise, bubble up to the conscious level, and we add our own rationality to it. Other times it's a bit more, I think, of an implicit cost benefit analysis. I think, with the unchosen suffering or the involuntary morbid curiosity, there's a quick calculation that goes on, and you look, and when you're looking, you're then still calculating, like, do I want to keep looking or do I leave? Right. So I don't think it's a one-time, okay, benefits are better than costs, I should do it. I think it's kind of a running tally, right? And as you're gathering more and more information, maybe it becomes less and less beneficial.
Well, yeah. I agree with all that. I just wonder. Let's take the horror films for example, right? I know plenty of people that are like super into horror films. I enjoy them myself as well. Yeah. And I always like watching horror films with people, right? And it'll be interesting, right? Because it's a type of projective of sorts, right? What's the type of horror? There's different subgenres of this, right? That's going to scare the shit out of you, right? It's just like, okay, yeah, I can watch an exorcism movie and I'm like, yeah, I don't believe in that shit. Like, whatever. It doesn't, it's interesting. Some of them can be done very well. I just doesn't bother me. I'll go to bed at night and be fine. Yeah, if I watch like a home invasion film though, I'm going to be pretty scared going to bed later that night. I'm like, fuck, did I lock all the doors? I put my alarm down. There's something to it. And
well, because you believe that somebody could invade your home, right? That's the
of
thing.
Course. That's more likely than, all this bullshit about like, someone's demonically possessed and all this fucking garbage. But the point is that some people that believe in that are terrified. They're not even going to let that in their home because they're going to be like, it's, defiling their home. Or like there's people that really believe it and they get terrified. Okay. Right. My point is, why? Right. Maybe it is an unconscious thing, but so, and I can agree with that. I don't disagree with that. But my point would be, why again and again and again and again? Like, do you know how many times I've seen the Halloween film, the original? So many times. It's just.
Well, so why? You're asking me why, but you're the one telling me you're doing it. So
yeah. Right. So for me, right, it's partly nostalgia, sure. Partly it's there's something about it that has a lot of really good filmmaking components to it. Sure. I've seen The Shining's an amazing film. It's one of the best horror films. And there's an element that's like, there's like a timeless feel to it, right? Yeah. Like it's like if you watch a film that has like jump scares, that stuff doesn't age well.
Yeah.
Because you know it, you're expecting it, like, okay, there's not a lot of substance there. But you can find a lot of horror elements, or maybe certain films that have horror or terror. And sometimes I think it is just like a nostalgia thing or a filmmaking thing or whatever. But, sometimes it is this idea of like, I mean, at least for me, it's like a reminder, right? It's like this continuous reminder. And again, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make logical sense. Like, why am I going to watch a movie I've seen a bunch of times that, tries to scare the shit out of you, right? It doesn't make any sense. But I do it. I have friends that do it. People do it. It doesn't make logical sense. I mean, there's the explanations you've given, that Paul's given, that, that I agree with, are unsatisfactory. Like, they're incomplete in my view.
So is your question why people continue to be horror fans?
Yeah, why do you keep doing the same movie or different iterations of it? Or what are you trying to get? Is it like let me see if this one's gonna really just like, terrify me, where I need like someone to sleep in my house with me for a month because I'm just, I don't know. I mean, is it just kind of upping the ante kind of thing? Like when Hereditary came out, that was a big deal. I mean, that was a very well done horror film that we hadn't had in a long time. And I remember it's really scared me when I watched the first time. I was just like, oh my goodness, I guess that's my thing, is why do we keep coming in terms of horror? Again, every year, especially around this time, in the fall and season. Why is that people keep coming back to it? What is it?
So I think there are two questions there. I think the first question is why do horror fans continue to be horror fans into their 40s and 50s, and why do some of them continue to be?
Right.
And I think the answer to that is that, well, there's a couple things. I mean, one thing is, if you look at movie genres, there aren't romance conventions really, right? There might be a few, but those aren't really a thing.
No.
Comic-Con kind of encapsulates the action stuff, but it's not really like it's not dedicated to that, right? There are some things that are dedicated to, like Star Wars has Star Wars conventions, right? Yeah. Or like certain films,
Marvel, Star Wars.
But there's not, but genre-wise, horror is really the only genre that has a strong sense of community. The horror community is there's no such thing. Nobody ever talks about the comedy community when it comes to films, right? There might be comedy troops and like the improv groups and things, but there's no community of people who like comedy films. There's no community of people who like action films. There's no community of people who like romance films, right?
Right.
But there is a community of people who like horror films. And maybe they don't even like the same horror films, they like different horror films. But there is a community, and they have conventions in every city every year, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know a good reason why for that, except to say that some of it probably has to do with people who are curious or interested in these kinds of things and start watching them. They do build a kind of nostalgia for those movies because of what they watched, right? Same reason that, like, why do I have nostalgia for whatever I have nostalgia for? Because I did it when I was a kid, right? It's not because it's anything particularly good. In fact, when you go back and play, if I go back, I still have my N64 when I was a kid, and I love it. And when I go back and play it, it's good, but it's like, wow, this is a really crappy game compared to games today.
Yeah, of course.
It's nostalgic, and I love it. And I think movies are the same way. I think if you go back and watch the original Halloween, like there's some elements of it that are timeless and that are really good, but then you watch a modern horror movie and it just doesn't compare in some ways, right? So there is the nostalgia component, there is the community component. So I think a lot of people who are interested and curious about these kinds of things and watch these kinds of films might be, I don't want to say ostracized, because they're not ostracized most of the time, but they are kind of social rebels. They are a bit outsiders in some way. And I think that creates a sense of community among the outsiders, right? So there becomes this like, you also like horror films? You must be like X, right? This coalitional stuff.
Yeah, that's fair.
And then I think that becomes its own sort of self-propelling machine of like, okay, well, let's get together and talk about horror films. And then it becomes a whole community, and then they have conventions and things. And I think it's the sense of identity that then propels people into long-term horror fandom. And of course, they like new movies, but aging horror fans are sometimes pretty like curmudgeonly about new horror films because there's nothing, it's the same reason that critics are also, the same way. It's like, unless it's something entirely fresh, they don't typically, horror films get terrible critic ratings all the time, unless it's something it's a little full of itself, frankly. Usually that's the only horror films that that get really good critic ratings, but they'll get great audience ratings, you know. Not quite as extreme as the new Dave Chappelle stuff, where it's like a 1% critic and like a 99% audience or whatever. But there's a similar idea going on there, you know. And yeah, but I think the sense of community gets built from this kind of slightly taboo stuff that people do. All these people do slightly taboo or interested in slightly taboo things, and then it becomes a piece of their identity. And then they do other things, like they have creepy art in their house, or they go to creepy, weird museums, and it just becomes this, I think, sense of identity that then built that you just don't see in other films, because they're not sort of the outsiders. You know, if you like romance, whatever, like comedy, almost everybody loves comedy. Most people like action movies. A lot of people do like horror movies, but it is a more select community, I guess, and it is seen differently. You know, it's if you look at award nominations, it's like there's no Oscars, right? There's no I guess Silence of the Lambs, depending on how people make that fall. I don't really care so much about that. It's more so the point that, like, you know, horror movies are never treated well at award ceremonies or anything formal, right? So it's still kind of seen as this second grade genre, and I think that creates an identity around it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that. I think it is more of that. And again, it's interesting how all of this, and like in many ways, it does not seem very conscious, right? I don't think it's very conscious. I think it kind of happens. But I agree with your estimation there. I think there's maybe not quite the same. Maybe it's just more for certain universes, but I think you do see this in sci-fi and fantasy as well.
Yeah. For the same reasons, right? Like,
right. For the same reasons.
It's not taboo, but it's like, it is kind of obscure, right? It's sort of put aside as an obscure thing, unless it's a big budget sci-fi film, and then it gets, you know. Yeah,
I mean, you're a nerd. I mean, that's what it is. I mean, like, that's just, you know, people. There's a certain. I mean, they have broad appeal now, many of these things, but like, you know, I mean, people that liked Lord of the Rings before the films. I mean, you were just a fantasy nerd. I mean, that's all it was. I mean, you know, or.
I think it's almost exactly what's going on, right? I mean, I think the threat learning stuff sort of drew them in initially because they were these people were predisposed to it, but then it built a sense of community in the same way that sci-fi has done that, or fantasy has done that.
I would say that there's just kind of more recent is, you know, I mean, you know, Dune was huge for people. I mean, right. Dune was, I mean, when Herbert wrote that in the 60s, I mean, it was, I mean, influenced everybody. I mean, people that did film, people that did other stories. I mean, it's the, you know, in that corpus of kind of fantasy sci-fi, I mean, it's huge. I mean, it's the big thing, you know, and, you know, so the fact, and, you know, there's been iterations of it that have been terrible. And so the new movie is very good. And most, at least so far, most of the fans really like it. And they really say, like, hey, this is finally, we got something that did it justice, and, you know, whatever. And, you know, and then it's an interesting thing, though, seeing people's conversations where, you know, you'll have kind of like the general public will kind of have some of their comments about it. And then you'll see all the fans be like, you don't know, you weren't there, you didn't suffer through this, you don't get to come into the group that easy. You know, there's this kind of.
I think you see that in horror too, a little bit.
Yes.
I mean, you do. You know, people are going to be commenting on Halloween. Halloween Kills has been incredibly not controversial, but just split opinion on it. You know, like all the hardcore Halloween fans whose identity is like, I'm a Halloween fan, love it because it's made for Halloween fans. But like everyone else is coming to it. I haven't seen it yet. I have seen most of the Halloween movies, or all of them, but I haven't seen the new one yet. But I'm sure it's objectively not a great film. There are probably some good aspects to it. But if you've watched the Halloween series and you like the Halloween series, it is a good film, right? Yeah. A good example of this for me, I love Resident Evil. So I grew up playing the game when I was very young. That was like my introduction almost to the horror genre, was like the Resident Evil on PS1, right? Yeah. I guess I was probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 or too young to be playing it. But I remember, you know, it's very nostalgic for me. And so when the movies started coming out, I loved them, right? I still love them. Everything after the first 2 movies are objectively bad movies. There's nothing. Yes, absolutely. Not a lot of redeeming quality. I will argue that the first 2 are pretty good, but everything after that is really not very good. But I still love it, right? Because it's like I'm invested in that universe. I'm invested in that idea. I'm very excited for the new one that's coming out that looks like it is very similar to the video games. I'm very excited for that. yeah, I think something similar goes on there with Halloween, right? Like people who are invested in that universe and then that identity are going to love it because it's made for them.
Yeah, this is how people have this idea of people. I mean, I'm a huge Star Wars fan, so and those fans are all over the map, right? I mean, I'm a diehard Star Wars fan, but I'm also very. It's interesting. I have different points of like what is important for me, and so I understand criticisms. Like I like the prequels. But a lot of Star Wars fans hate them, and it's almost like a thing. You have to kind of hate them. But I think people are not charitable to them. And I think in terms of story, I think it's fantastic, especially the third one.
There's a really niche thing in the horror community with the Halloween series, actually. So Rob Zombie remade.
Oh yes, yeah. Did you like the remake? I liked it.
I do, but it's like that's a taboo thing.
Oh, that's a very taboo thing. I realized that. The first one was really good.
It gives him too much of a reason to be.
Yeah. They didn't want the backstory. They just want the creepy guy. They don't want the backstory. That's how I felt about Dr. Sleep.
I'm a big fan of Rob Zombie, so I probably went into it being like, it's probably going to be good.
I thought they were good. I thought they were good. Well done for what they were.
But I think it's similar to the Star Wars prequels.
Yeah. This is the same thing with Alien. I mean, everybody. I mean, people put Alien up here, and look, don't get me wrong, Ridley Scott's a genius. Alien's amazing. It holds. Yeah.
But Prometheus is really good.
Prometheus and Covenant, definitely Prometheus, was fantastic, and people shit on that movie, and it's like, no, this is like an atheist mythology, right? It's just fantastic. It's like an atheist origin stories. Like it's amazing. The story is great, the visuals are great, everything's great about that film, and I loved Covenant, not as much as Prometheus, but I thought Covenant was cool.
It was a good film.
People hate those films, and it's just and I'm like, did you see Aliens 2 and 3? That's terrible. They're terrible. It's just they're awful films objectively, especially the third one and all the other iterations of it. And the first one's lightning in a bottle. It's amazing. It holds. What is it? 1978, 1979. I mean, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. I mean, you can watch it at any point. It's amazing. But I agree. I think people have nostalgia for some of these things. I definitely agree with you on the community piece. And not just community, but what kind of community? It's kind of like
an identity, right? Like you are an
yeah, it's people that listen to punk hardcore music.
Yeah,
it's like this sort of rebellious outsider,
lifestyle. Right?
Yeah, it's a lifestyle. It's that whole thing. I think that's I still think there are questions left unresolved, but
I think so, or else, I hope so, because otherwise I've got to find something else to
right. But I think those answers are satisfactory of why people really enjoy horror. It's just interesting because at least I'm thinking about certain people that I know in my head that are really into horror. They're all different. They're not there's a stereotypical punk hardcore person, if you take that analogy with music, right? But with people that do horror, you'll have people that there's not a mold of a person that likes horror. So that's interesting. I think in terms of, it always goes back to me about the differences in personality and temperament, and why, again, things we don't know, right? But why do certain temperaments or certain personalities or certain aspects of a person's personality gravitate towards that stuff? And they could be very different, in other situations. Socially, they would never interact, but man, that's the one thing that pulls them together. It's very, very interesting. Again, there's things we still don't know about it, which is it's just more work for you to do, I guess.
More work, that's right. More work for me to do.
I was going to ask about a little bit more specifically here. Two final points on this, which is what can we say about the different thresholds? So again, obviously there's different personalities, but I'll just take a I don't want to get really niche here, but there are certain films though that are very graphic in terms of violence. We're talking about beheadings and people cutting off body parts, and it makes the Saw movies look like child's play. It's just not that bad. There's some pretty
there's like the mainstream. There's like the mainstream gore, which is like Hostel and Saw, and then there's like, I think somebody made a ridiculous meme, like the iceberg meme with like Saw and Hostel at the top, and then all the crazy films below that.
Yeah,
right?
that's true.
I've seen a few of them, and yeah, you're right. They're just a different breed.
It's one of those things where I'm like, how is this made? Because this looks very disturbing. And I guess the question is, why would people watch that?
Yeah. I think that I do think that has to do more with, I would love to do a study on this. I guess I could do a study on this. Probably there's something like deprivation sensitivity or sensation seeking is really driving that, because they're looking for something, they're looking for the next like high in some way. It's like they're looking for what can really shock me, right?
I would have to think that those people are extremely high on openness to experience.
Probably, yeah. I would imagine they're high on openness to experience. I would imagine they're very high in boredom susceptibility and deprivation sensitivity and all the measures that tap into basically this need for stimulation, and I think that also this is something I plan to look into more, but have like lightly looked into. I think it probably relates to depression a little bit, and people who are feeling bouts of depression have trouble literally feeling things, right? And this is something that Jeremy Stewart and I also are more with the NSSI, the non-suicidal self-injury stuff. But in some ways, could morbid curiosity be a way for people to more safely feel something if it's an extreme form? And I've talked to horror fans. I've done a lot of like informal interviews, I guess you could call them. I mean, that's actually how I started on this morbid curiosity stuff, is I literally just went out and like talked to a lot of horror fans about, and especially the anxiety stuff that we're going to jump into in a minute, probably. A lot of that was really just anecdote that I then tried to build something out of. But it started out with lots and lots of sort of interviews, I guess you could call them, like, informal interviews. And depression came up quite a bit for people, and they would mention that they tend to like the gore, like the gorier stuff. I think because it's more shocking, you get more of a shock value. So yeah, I think that there's going to be a deprivation sensitivity or a need for sensation that either comes from being high sensation seeking or potentially having some kind of problem feeling things, right? Maybe other issues.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. I also think there's probably some element that some folks are probably just able to dissociate from some of this stuff, or compartmentalize things much better. Again, this is a very easy. I think you see different media for that. Meaning like people who are able to dissociate easily, like scary video games and maybe extreme movies. People who can't do it as easily but still have an interest in that might do a graphic book, like a scary novel that's very graphic, Stephen King novel or something that's really graphic. Because it's easier. It takes more effort to conjure that up, to conjure that image up. It's not in your face, so people who have like probably very strong, very high empathy, for example, and like sort of empathize without trying to. I think people like that probably need something like a book. They don't need it to be forced on them, like the scares or the morbid aspects to be forced on them. But they might still have an interest in it. It's just they want to have control over how strong that stimulus is. I agree. I mean, I'm not a big fan of Game of Thrones, but I've read the books and I've watched the show, and I remember I would sometimes suggest people or ask them if they watch it, and they would say, oh no, I can't do all that violence and gore. And then there are other people that would be like, oh, that's in there, I don't even recognize it. It's just, and all over the place and everywhere in between, right? People are just, I'm just watching the story, I don't even care about that stuff. It's like, there's like some pretty, I guess objectively, pretty strong scenes in that show. But I think those are in some ways necessary for some stories, right? I think those, of course, those make it consequential, right? That's what makes there are no stories that are just happy stories. We don't ever consume happy stories. We consume stories that might end on a happy note. But there has to be something like bad that happens in the story in some way, right? Who was it that said this? You always need some point of conflict or a struggle. Was it Aristotle? I don't remember. I'm so fuzzy on this. There's one of the philosophers that said that you always need something, an obstruction, something that's getting in the way of your goal or something like that.
That sounds like something a Greek philosopher.
Yeah, it's one of them. I don't maybe Seneca, or I don't remember who it was, but it's something like that. And it's, yeah. I mean, I think
that's what makes it interesting, right? I think that maps onto, well, you say of course, but like, why? Why is that of course? Why is it? Well,
because that's a mirroring of sorts in a sort of way of what life is.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, but then why are you trying to escape? I agree with you on all of this. I'm kind of playing devil's advocate here because I think we sometimes take behaviors or psychological constructs for granted, and I think this might be one of them. Like, well, of course, a story with a conflict is more interesting. Well, okay. I mean, like maybe, of course. And you say, okay, maybe because it mirrors life, but then you kind of have to ask, like, why are we spending so much time simulating these things instead of just living? If it's just mirroring life, then why do we want to escape into something that's mirroring life rather than something that doesn't mirror life?
Well, because I think, so I do subscribe to some of this, not entirely,
okay.
But there is, I think, a kind of unconscious archetypal values, right? I do think Jung had some he did have some valuable things here. I think on terms of how we understand narrative and stories and things like that. We do have, I think, unconsciously these ideas of like, the story that I have or the story I want to see. I think people don't realize it, that they wanted to see some aspect of their life of sorts of, look, people don't like, typically, I mean, this is I'm generalizing, but people aren't going to go see a movie where nothing happens. They're boring. And
what if it was just good things happening? What if it was just a bunch of like, that's still something happening, like a bunch of good things happening to someone?
Yeah. I think people don't really buy it or really get into it as much. It's not as highly valuable for a lot of people. I could be wrong on that. I do think it's the same way in like anticlimactic films too. People hate those films.
Yeah.
They're not very popular. I like them, but again, I'm looking at them for a different. I don't need a happy ending. I don't need an ending. It doesn't. Those movies, right, where this just it fades to black. You're like, well, what happened? Wait, what do we just do all this for? Like, people hate those kind of movies. And I mean, I enjoy them because I hate the whole like cookie cutter, over and over and over the same kind of thing. But I do think there's some kind of conflict that people want. I mean, I don't want to pick on this too much, right? Because, I think
I agree with you, but I think the question is just why. I agree with you. People do want that.
My best answer for this is that it goes back to the imaginative kind of play. It goes back to the idea of, well, I want to see it simulated of sorts. I want to see it kind of, I don't want it to happen to me, but I just kind of want to see it. And then, people become very invested. I mean, sometimes I'll watch, films with friends or family and sometimes the question, what would you do in that situation? Right. And people do this, right? They'll say, it's like, I don't know. It's a fucking movie. I'm just watching the movie. But that comes in. It
is the unconscious sort of motivation that sometimes arises to this.
Yeah. You're seeing the stimulus and you're like, what would, it's like when someone,
you're more curious about it when it's not a cookie cutter thing, right? You're more curious about it when it's I think that's exactly my point with morbid curiosity. I think that it's this, people don't always, I know you said it was an unsatisfying answer, but I think you just gave me the same answer for what people like.
Yes, I did. I did. Right.
I think it's right. I think that's right. I think it's about like wanting to simulate, not necessarily consciously, sometimes consciously, but not necessarily, but this urge to kind of simulate things that things I have experienced and I didn't handle well, or things that could happen to me that I want to be able to handle well.
But I don't want to know that though. I don't want to know into the movie, hey, this is what's going to happen. It's going to be this simulation. I want to be almost surprised by it.
Yes. And I think we won't go on the too long. I think you're right. And I agree with you. And I think that, I do think that though, it's still about this idea of play, right? It's about, why do lion cubs play fight? Why do they rough and tumble? Well, one answer, one like proximate, if we're going back to Tenberg, like one sort of proximate answer is that it's fun and they get a dopamine rush from it, and that causes them a rewarding feeling, and they do it again. Okay, that's a good mechanism answer, but it's not a very satisfying answer, right? Or what's the reason that they ever started playing in the first place? Why would that even be a thing? Well, it helps them practice motor skills and behavior strategies for dealing with dominance competitions as adults, like the pups or the, what do you call a lion kit? I don't know what you call a lion cub. Well, cub, I guess, yeah.
Cubs, yeah.
Yeah, cub, yeah. Mm-hmm. The cubs or the wolf pups or whatever, like the more that they play fight, the more practice they're going to be at those kinds of things that matter later. And I think something similar is going on with scary stories. It's not so much about behavior strategy. Well, maybe some behavior strategy. It's not about really motor skills or anything, but it's about emotional practice. It's about dealing with emotions that and maybe this is a good segue into that, into my anxiety stuff, but it's a good practice for how to deal with emotions that we typically don't deal with. You know, we try to avoid, in our everyday life, we try to avoid anxiety. I don't want to feel anxious. I don't want to feel afraid in my everyday life. But like bad things are bound to happen, right? It's going to happen. And so it's a good idea if I can like feel comfortable in dealing with something when something bad happens. And one way to do that is to practice with it in a play setting.
Yeah. I did want to get to that because I know is one at least one paper you have on this, which is, you know, how does this have, or how does certain elements from, you know, horror films or things that are potentially scary, how they could have some clinical application. So I guess first, before you tell me that, how do you usually distinguish between anxiety and fear? And how do you see other synonyms between dread, terror, horror, etc.?
Yeah, there are kind of a lot of words for this, like what happens in a horror film: dread, terror, anxiety, fear.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the super simple, probably most widely accepted difference between anxiety and fear is that fear is about something immediate, concrete, observable. Anxiety is more about something potential, right? Or something that hasn't happened yet, but will. So anxiety is preparatory, fear is reactionary in some ways. That's a simple. Of course, there are exceptions to that, I'm sure, and nuances to that. But that's the most simple difference, I think. And then when it comes to, I don't know, I mean, horror, dread, terror. Stephen King has a pretty interesting. What is he? It's like his 3 levels of horror, and he has 3 different ways.
Yeah, I've heard this.
Yeah, like the 3 different ways that you can scare someone, I guess, in a horror film or in a horror book in this case. And at the lowest level, like I guess what he would call the cheapest would be the gross out, right? That's like what happens. Well, let me do this in a different way, I guess. Let me do them in chronological order. So the best one, the one that he tries to achieve, I think he calls the terror. And this, I think, is just anxiety. It's like the dread of something about to happen. It's like you're letting the reader or the audience create their own worst nightmares, right? You've got an atmosphere that's scary, that something is about to happen. And then the next level up, or the next level down, I guess, in this case, would be the horror. And this is when you see the bad thing. So this is, you have anxiety and the terror, and then when the horror happens, this is fear. You see the monster for the first time. And then the third level would be the gross out. This is what happens when you interact with the monster, right? This is the outcome of the horror. And I think in some ways that maps onto this idea of morbid curiosity being like, there's the dangerous person, and then there's the violence, and then there's the disgust, So yeah, I think that I'm not too concerned with the difference between dread and terror and things like that with respect to the anxiety research, but anxiety and fear, I would say anxiety is more about a potential something that could happen or something that will happen and just hasn't happened yet. And fear is a bit more immediate and concrete.
Yeah, and so tell us, I guess you were starting to get into it, but how does it factor in where we can use elements of, horror or from films or books or whatever that could be, really helpful? I think in the one paper you say that could have increased emotional clarity, challenging emotional reasoning, tolerating somatic experiences, practicing cognitive reappraisal. I think there's a nice chart in there and such. So kind of explain maybe some of the I don't really say adaptive elements, but some of the applied pieces of trying to work with someone that has maybe clinical anxiety.
Yeah, I think to your hesitation with adaptive, I think I wouldn't make the hard argument that these are like, I don't know that we have an evolved predisposition to tell scary stories. I mean, maybe, but I wouldn't make the hard argument for that. I do think that they could be applied, right? They could be used in adaptive ways, but that would be different than us being evolved to do this kind of thing. Right. So yeah, I think that there are a couple things. So in that paper I talk about 2 different things. I talk about like how horror could help with anxiety in the moment. Like if you're feeling anxious right now, how does it help? And then there's the long-term kind of strategies. So I worked with a clinical psychologist, Kara Christensen, on this. And she like lent her expertise in clinical psychology, and I kind of brought the horror stuff to that, and we wrote this really great paper together. It's very long, but it's a good one, I think. So I guess starting at the very beginning, like let's say you're a person in this case with, let's say, generalized anxiety disorder, and your background's in clinical psych, right?
Yep. So
please correct me if I get something wrong, because it's probably going to happen.
So far, so good.
so generalized anxiety disorder, one of the main features of it, to my understanding, is that I don't really have anxiety that bad, I don't think. So this is more secondhand than personal knowledge. But to my understanding, in generalized anxiety disorder, you have the physiological manifestations of anxiety and you feel anxious, but you don't tend to have a target of your anxiety. It's not typically a thing. It's kind of a nebulous cloud of anxiety, right? Is that accurate?
Yes. What usually happens is that most people, not always, but there's a lot of internalized components to generalized anxiety. That's not to say that there aren't externalized things in the environment, but a lot of the feeling of anxiety, of this anticipatory kind of dread or worry, is not necessarily for a specific.
It's not for like a bill that's due in a week. It's just like you're feeling anxious. Yeah.
And it won't really have necessarily an antecedent all the time.
Sure.
So yeah.
Okay. So this is the type that I think actually horror could work the best with, this kind of something like generalized anxiety disorder. And so, okay, you're feeling anxious, can't really pinpoint why, and that's really uncomfortable, right? It's really uncomfortable to feel anxious and not be able, there's nothing to point to and say, hey, this is making me anxious, so I can take 1, 2, 3, like these 3 steps to fix it.
Right.
So in generalized anxiety disorder, you are feeling anxious about something, but it's sometimes difficult for you to pinpoint what it is you're feeling anxious about. And that I think can be very uncomfortable and also not very conducive to fixing the problem or fixing anxiety. Right?
And you don't know when it's going to happen. So that's the other part of it.
It comes about you, it surprises you, and then you're like, well, wait, I'm feeling anxious, but I don't know what I'm feeling anxious about.
Right.
So what that does, would tell your brain there's a threat, but you haven't found it yet. So you need to be more vigilant in order to find it, which creates this bad feedback cycle of perseverative negative thought and worry and rumination and all these things that just increase anxiety more and more. Right. I think horror is particularly good, or could be particularly good, at helping with that kind of anxiety, and particularly with people who are feeling it, because if you're anxious and you're very vigilant towards threat, it means you're going to show this negativity bias that we talked about earlier, where you kind of attend to things that are threatening. Horror movies, of course, the core of a horror movie is a threat, right? That's the core plot line. Right. And so they'll do, I would imagine, a better job of drawing in an anxious viewer. So there's some studies on people who feel anxious. They're more immersed in things like VR and more immersed when there's a threat in the virtual reality world. And so horror is really good at drawing in and immersing anxious viewers, which can help kind of kick them out of that rumination cycle in some ways. Now they're still feeling anxious, right? Because now they're just anxious about whatever's happening on the screen. But once you've done that, that's an important transition, I think, because now you're anxious about something that's happening on the screen. You do have control over it. Now you do have a target. Now you do have something you're feeling anxious about. And in addition to that, you now have these tools that you didn't have when you were, even if it was something in the real world that you're anxious about. So if I'm watching a scary movie, I have control to some extent over how scary it is. I can watch it during the daytime if it's too scary. I can watch it with the lights on. I can watch it with the sound turned down lower. I can cover my eyes at scary points. I can look up where the jump scares are. I can do all these things that allow me to down-regulate the intensity. Or if I'm feeling it, I can upregulate it. I can watch it at night or turn the sound on, wear headphones, watch it by myself. And I think the important thing and of course, then the anxiety goes away at some point because the horror movie ends, and most horror movies, not all of them, most of them have some kind of resolution. But at the very least, the movie turns off and the threat is gone, right? Parasympathetic nervous system sort of ramps back up. You get a kind of feel good from that, a feel good sensation from that. But I think what it does if you do that frequently, so like a horror fan, for example, is that one thing you learn is that the intensity that you feel, so the degree to which you feel anxious, does not always map onto how bad things are going to be. And so we saw this. I just got back from Detroit I was there a couple weekends this month doing haunted house research. And for some of the participants, we put heart rate monitors on them and sent them to the haunt. What we saw for some people was that their heart rate was like 150 or 160 for most of the haunt, which is insane. That's like that's a very, very rigorous workout for like 40 minutes.
Yes, it is.
It is, yeah. And these people, that's the same kind of heart rate you would have if I dropped you in like a lion cage at the zoo and you were faced with a lion. Like that's the same intensity you would have. But obviously those two things have very different outcomes. And so I think one thing that it teaches you is that the degree to which you feel bad, the degree to which you're having these negative or anxious feelings does not always map onto the outcome. And it helps you, I think, learn that. Like I can feel very anxious and I may not be able to identify why, or maybe I can, but like it doesn't always indicate that something incredibly bad is going to happen. I think it also teaches you how to feel comfortable feeling anxious, or as comfortable as you can. So it teaches you to, sit with your anxiety in some ways. Because I think one thing that anxious people do is they try to avoid feeling anxious because they're afraid of how they're going to respond, right? Most people are afraid of how they're going to respond, even if you're not an anxious person.
Sure.
You don't want to feel anxious in public or feel anxious in your daily life. But if you're watching a scary movie, it's okay. It's like, it's acceptable to feel anxious. You're supposed to feel anxious. It's not just acceptable. You're supposed to feel anxious. And so I think it kind of teaches you, in some ways it's similar to exposure therapy, and it teaches you to sit with those negative feelings and overcome them and show you that you can overcome them, right? In fact, one of the things at the haunted house that we saw were that people who had the highest anxiety going into the haunt and who were the most scared at the end, those are the people who, when we asked them the questions at the end, they would say that they felt like they had learned something about themselves. They felt like they had learned how to deal with stressful or high intensity situations that they didn't think they could deal with before. So it gives them kind of almost a self-confidence boost. Like, I can actually handle this, even though it feels like I can't at the beginning. And the idea is that over time, that helps you with things like emotional clarity, because if you're just feeling bad, I think that giving the anxiety a source and giving it a plot and a story, it helps you kind of identify the ups and downs that you feel throughout that story. Depending on how good the movie is, maybe, but there's a bit of emotional clarity work that you can do throughout that, because you're going to be feeling different kinds of things, right? And one of those things is the anxiety that you're typically avoiding. And I think it helps you kind of draw the boundaries around that a little bit. It could also help you reappraise situations, because again, just because I'm feeling very anxious doesn't mean that it's going to be terribly bad, right? You can kind of, I think, learn how to reappraise those feelings and basically take a step back. You kind of learn how to take a step back and evaluate the situation a little better when you're in the throes of feeling anxious. Yeah, so in many ways, I think it's just practice, right? And it's practice that you might find from a therapist. I'm not suggesting people go home and watch horror movies and stop going to their therapist. I'm just suggesting that I think that the horror genre broadly could be a tool for therapists, actually, and it could be a tool for people who are hesitant to go to therapy, especially like men, for example. There are a lot of men are much more likely to be horror fans. To my knowledge, are much less likely to go to therapy if they need it. Probably less likely to admit they're feeling anxious or whatever. But if your therapist is like, yeah, go home and watch Saw, but think about it. Don't go home and just mindlessly do it, right? Like, kind of think about how you can give them a worksheet. You can give them essentially, I guess, like homework on how to think through this and how to think about how you're feeling at different points. But it feels more fun than maybe just doing regular work at the therapist. And so, yeah, it was basically just a very modest suggestion that mental health researchers and professionals think about how scary play could be utilized to build resilience in a lot of ways, and especially for people who struggle with anxiety, and in particular, maybe something like generalized anxiety disorder.
Yeah, I think I don't disagree with the kind of general way of trying to use it. Use horror kind of in an applied way, and use the material in a way that could be very practical for many people. I do have some concerns, I guess, about it. I guess the first concern would be, so if we're talking about generalized anxiety disorder, so within the anxiety disorder cluster, there are a variety of anxiety disorders that are not too dissimilar to be in a different category, but are distinct enough, I should say. Okay. So, generalized anxiety disorder is part of anxiety disorders, but it is distinct enough from something like agoraphobia,
Right.
or something that is distinct from panic disorder, and the first thing that comes to my mind is specific phobias.
I don't think horror would be good for specific phobias.
Yeah, no, that's no.
I think that's the first, like when I mention exposure therapy, sometimes I think that's what people's minds go to, are like, oh, well, if they're afraid of spiders, show them like a freak or something. That's not what I would suggest at all.
No, it'd be
not the idea at all. I think it's more like the more important thing would be the emotional exposure aspect of emotion.
Yeah.
Of exposure. Right. I think that's more where they fall in line, not about specific phobias.
Yeah. So that's kind of my piece of this too, is that I think for very specific things, whether it's specific phobia or if it's, panic disorder or things like that, probably not the best thing. But I do think, and exposure therapy isn't really used for generalized anxiety disorder, which is curious here. But I do think that it is interesting that you could have a more interactive way of trying to say, how can you sit with anxiety in a like a benign setting.
A way where there are no consequences. There are no consequences.
Yeah, it's a movie, you turn it off. I guess my worry would be, my fear would be,
my anxiety about this is
my dread is I just would wonder for folks, because I work with folks that have generalized anxiety disorder pretty regularly. There's a lot of not being able to shut it off. So, okay, I watch a film or even watch 30 minutes of a film. It doesn't even have to be the whole thing. I'm doing a certain exercise or I'm doing a worksheet or something like that. And okay, it's kind of a controlled setting. I'm sitting with anxiety. I'm going through all these things. I'm doing a kind of rating. What's my feeling like? What am I thinking? How am I stopping those thoughts? How am I, whatever.
Sure.
I think all of that could be super helpful, but I would worry that would just, again, this is where it just depends on the person and their the severity of their anxiety. But I think it would be something that, okay, well, that's done, and then I turn it off, and then I'm fucking mess the rest of the week because I can't get this stimulus out of my head of this anticipatory horror, like what's going to be behind the next door, and it's like, oh my god, and it's just and then they have nightmares or they have all these other things. I think it could be. So there's a lot of concerns I would have, but here's what I will say. I will say that I do think it could be helpful if potentially, I mean, I don't know, you'd have to kind of play with it, but I do think you could use some of those elements with a therapist, right? A therapist wants to use 10, 15 minutes in a session and say like, okay, here's something that's not connected to your life. It's just a movie. We all know this. I'm right here. It's, 2 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. It's bright and sunny out. Like, it's just, and just kind of go through it and just kind of push through it slowly, titrate up to that. I think it could be, in terms of a kind of innocuous stimulus, it could be potentially a useful tool.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely would not say it's a blanket recommendation or a blanket suggestion that this works for everyone. It doesn't. And part of my research is trying to figure out who does it work for, because some people have discovered this for themselves. A lot of people have discovered this for themselves. And it was like almost shocking to me how many of those interviews I did, it was people who said, when I start feeling anxious, you talked about like, if you watch a horror movie, then you feel crappy the rest of the week. But these people, this select group of people were telling me the opposite. It's like, I feel crappy and I watched the movie and I feel better now.
Yeah.
And so what I'm interested in is, sure, if it can't, well, I guess the first question is, who does this work for and how, right? And that's part of what that paper tries to address. But then the second question would be, for the people it doesn't work for, if we know something about the people that it does work for, can we make it work for these other people? Can we help it work for them? And if not, like, what's the difference in these two populations, right? Why does it work for one group and not work for the other? And that could tell us either something really interesting about anxiety itself or something interesting about the way that we diagnose it. If this particular type of thing is working for a subset of people with the same anxiety disorder, but not this other subset. And I think as well, I would say that this is something more like a therapist would have to know their do you call them clients or patients? I've heard different.
Interchangeable.
Yeah,
It's
know their client. Let's say they'd have to know their client much better. They would know their client much better than like I would, for example, and they would know if this is an appropriate kind of thing that they could handle, right? And I've had therapists reach out to me, email me, and when they read my papers and say, I've done this, like I've given horror movies as homework, and I've had people reach out to me and say, my therapist has given me horror movies for homework. Mm-hmm. I think it's not a common thing. I think it's more of a very select thing, but I think that understanding why that could work could be really useful and informative for clinical science, clinical psychology.
Yeah, I think the way I would conceptualize it is that you're using a potent stimulus that is removed enough from the person's situation. It's kind of my fancy way of saying it. And I think that that could be really helpful. And I could see that in terms of what group folks could it work for and what group it doesn't, and could it be applied for the folks that it doesn't. I really think that, it really would depend on a little bit of the person, but I think it just depends on the clinical presentation of the anxiety. So even if you just stayed with generalized anxiety, okay, we're going to take X amount of people that have generalized anxiety disorder, you're still going to have some variance with other things. I mean, whenever you do the study, you're just going to have a lot of ANCOVAs and MANOVAs in your future trying to look at the interactions. But I think it would just be I think it really would just depend on the longevity, the presentation, the severity, yeah, right. And then when you start looking at kind of the some of the threats to the external validity, what are other things going on in their life that are contributing, I'm in the middle of this study and then someone, this X that I have a restraining order, just, blah, blah, blah. There's just so many other things that could happen that would also implicate. So I think it could be, I think it should be done. It could be interesting. My guess would be that it would be a bunch of factors, but my guess would be really primarily just on the presentation of the anxiety and I guess the severity of it. And so I think, and that this is just me, just kind of fresh thoughts. I think that for folks that have a kind of mild to moderate generalized anxiety disorder, it could probably be very useful many times for many people. I mean,
that's my intuition as a non-therapist would be like people with mild to moderate anxiety.
Yeah, that's also.
No, I mean, there are lots of cases of people, and again, this is just anecdote, but I think it's worth it. I've seen enough of them. I think it's worth trying to understand why. There are some people with just crippling anxiety that are horror fans.
Yeah.
Like just crippling, and they're huge horror fans. And maybe it's just, when you have 7.5 or 8 billion people, whatever we're up to now on Earth, you're going to find these rare cases where people, can do two things at once, right? They can feel very anxious and love horror movies. You're going to have traits that are kind of bizarre show up. But it definitely is not, I would say it's like not an uncommon thing. It's not talked about a lot. There's a documentary coming out, I think, next year on mental health and horror, but it's just something that nobody has talked about except for people in the horror community. And if you talk to them about it, they'll talk your ear off about it, because nobody has ever written about this. There are no scientific papers on it. I did a little pilot study recently with a master's student that showed that horror fans are much more likely to have anxiety. They're more likely to have experienced a trauma in their life, according, I think it was a DSM measure we used for that. And in particular, certain types of horror fans are more likely to have high anxiety or have experienced trauma. So I think there's something going on there with this idea of simulation. I think there have been studies with PTSD and people have PTSD and how much they like or don't like war movies or use or don't use war-related movies. Yeah. And so I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there that just nobody is looking into. I mean, could you imagine even if it only worked on 10% of people, if horror movies were just a way to help with something, and even if it was a small percentage of people, if it was 5 to 10%, if you have, I forget what the numbers are, but it's an insane amount of people that have diagnosed anxiety in the U.S. I mean, that's a huge impact, right?
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, I overwhelmingly applaud you for doing the research, because we need to know. I mean, it's hard research because there's so many things.
Well, and again, that theoretical
we need to know it though.
Yeah, that theoretical paper was really just like, hey, clinical psychologists, please look at this and figure this out.
Yeah, no,
I think there's something here.
Yeah.
It wasn't a very like hard-nosed argument. No, I wasn't saying like, yes, you should be. My co-author and I were like, yes, you need to be. How dare you be diagnosing anxiety and then giving people horror movies to watch? It was more so just saying like, look at all these interesting things that might be going on.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think it's great. I think there's definitely a lot there for it because it's again, kind of how I said earlier. It's a stimulus that is removed from the person's experience.
Yeah.
But it is still a good stimulus that could be potentially useful for some folks. Any other disorders? You mentioned depression earlier, but is there other disorders where maybe this kind of way of doing things could be used?
Yeah, I mean, I think depression is the next one to look into just because in my talks with people, that's the second most common thing that's popped up. And I'm, like I said, I'm doing a little bit of that work with this clinical psychologist in Canada. And then of course, depression and how it relates to suicidal ideation in some ways.
Yeah.
I think trauma would be an interesting one because a lot of people do mention traumas. I haven't looked into that because that's a tricky one for the same reason that phobias are a tricky one, right?
Oh, yeah.
That certainly has a lot of individual differences in like whether or not watching a simulation of something that's similar to what happened to you would be helpful or not. For some people, the costs are too high for that, right? Like the potential costs are very high for that one. I think they're not as high for scary movies.
Maybe. I mean, I think I could have this wrong, but I think some VAs in the country use some form of VR.
For exposure for PTSD.
Yeah, for exposure for PTSD. Yeah. So I don't think.
Well, I think conceptually, it's not far fetched. I just meant for like me researching it.
Oh yeah.
I would need someone who's an expert in. And specifically like
trauma
and PTSD who would be interested in collaborating with me or doing it themselves or whatever. But I do think trauma is an interesting one because there are a lot of, again, in those interviews, people that would mention it's a way for them to kind of deal with that or reprocess it. There's a really great paper by, who's the group? Ben Belay, I think, was the first author on it. And it was about people who self-trigger. People who have they have traumas, they've had a trauma in their life, and they go to these online discussion boards, I guess, and they talk about it. And they did a survey on these discussion boards and found that a lot of people with traumas are self-triggering. So they're trying to re-expose themselves kind of in a safe way or in a simulated way to the thing that happened to them. And I think probably there are a lot of horror fans that do that. I think that, so I think anxiety is the most obvious. Not the most obvious. Actually, it's just the most interesting one to me because why would a genre meant to evoke anxiety help with anxiety, right?
It seems very counterintuitive.
Yeah, it does. But though, if you think about it, I mean, what is anxiety sort of characterized by? Well, one thing it's characterized by is vigilance towards threat, gathering information about threats. What is morbid curiosity? At least what do I think is characterized by? Learning about threats, right? So they kind of have this similar threat detection core to them, which probably explains these positive correlations between the two. But I think depression and suicidal ideation is one interesting area that I'm looking into a little bit. And I think PTSD or trauma would be another one that's really interesting. Yeah,
no, for sure. I guess my last question is, how can just more people in general, how can they understand I don't want to say the true nature, I guess, but how can they understand more about morbid curiosity and harness it into something productive and or creative and how can morbid curiosity unveil or uncover things about ourselves?
I think the best way to do that is buy my book in mid to late 2023. Until then, I think people need to give it a chance. I think in the same way that horror is kind of judged immediately for its content, topics related to morbid curiosity are as well. And I think people need to not be afraid to kind of look at what seem to be the darker side of things and get something out of it, right? Like learn how to be curious about things that are scary, learn how to be curious about things that seem dark and disturbing, because those are the areas that, most people have avoided thinking about, and probably the areas where there's a lot to learn or a lot to help you understand it. I don't know what all there is. I think one thing, I think with the anxiety, what it's helping people understand is at least how to deal with those kind of feelings, right? But I think that in general, if you're asking, how can people sort of embrace their morbid curiosity. I think that one thing that you have to do is kind of reevaluate, how bad you think it is to be curious about something, how taboo it is. I think a lot of these things, it's just a little bit taboo to be interested in it. So I think you just have to be willing to jump in.
Yeah. I would definitely agree. I think that is harder for some people than for others. And, but that doesn't mean I don't think people should do it. I think they should. I think that,
it's not everyone's.
You're trying to understand more about the human experience and what it means to be human in life. And that does include some dark corners of what it means to be human.
We see these themes too in rituals and religions all the time. Like there's morbid curiosity. There wouldn't be much to religion and rituals if there weren't aspects of morbid curiosity to it. There's tons of dangers and threats and death in these things. And so I think when they're embedded in a certain kind of story, we don't think about it as morbid, or we don't think about it as taboo. And so I think maybe people just need to consider like how ubiquitous these topics are in our daily life, and we just don't realize it, right? And just because it's put into an entertaining form, or because it's put into, let's say, like a horror movie where it's just meant for entertainment and not life lessons, it doesn't mean that you can't learn something from that.
Of course. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Well, where can people find you online? Where can they find your research and your work and all the relevant places?
So you can go to my website, which is just www.coltanscrivner.com. So on there, I have all my free PDFs of every paper preprint that I have. Also popular press stuff I've written for like my Psychology Today blog. So if you look up on Psychology Today, I have a blog called Morbid Minds where I write about psychology of morbid curiosity and horror fans. And then on Twitter as well, @Morbid Psych.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Coltan, this was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed the conversation. These topics are terribly interesting for me, and it does bring out all of the strangeness of humans that we're still trying to figure out. And so I really just had so much fun and such a blast talking with you about all this stuff. It's fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. You're a great conversational partner. Some people are a little more or less. You were very prepared, which is good. You had a lot of interesting questions and a lot of interesting angles, and it was nice to actually chat with someone with clinical training, because that's where a lot of my research is headed. Is kind of in this realm of how is it at least related to mental health, and if it's related to it, can it be beneficial in some ways? So it was really cool to get your perspective on that. No. I mean, this was. I appreciate that, and I mean, I try my hardest to really just put the focus on the person, and whatever their interest is and whatever their focus is, and that's what I try to do here. And you're doing such really good work and really interesting work, and so I have my own curiosity about it, and so I really do appreciate you coming on and being generous with your time and energy, and I thought it was great. So thanks so much. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks.